Welcome everybody to Beg, Borrow, Speak and our second webinar on reading and writing strategies.
Hi.
Do you want to introduce yourself, Erica?
Yeah, this is Erica Alvarez, and we're back with another webinar. And it's just to introduce you to some of the reading and writing strategies we do in our class, and some of the social, emotional scaffolding we do and support we do for our students. So we're doing a quick little webinar, and we're going to introduce you to those things. Please leave questions, comments, or any worries that you have. You can email us at begborrowspeak.com or follow the link on that last little bubble right over here. And we'll get started. Sarah, you ready?
Yeah, can I say something first?
Sure.
I think if you're going to work at a Title I school or any school where kids struggle with reading and writing, you have to pair this social emotional together with it, because you're asking them to take emotional risk. Some people only tend to associate this with math, but I think all learning involves some sort of emotional risk. So that's why it's good to include these two things.
For sure. Yeah. We're on reading. So we've talked about different reading and writing strategies in the past that kind of work for us. And we've put those up on Beg, Borrow, Speak. You can just check it out. But this actual strategy happened for me this semester, and it was extremely successful. So you probably recognize this. If you went to grad school and you had to do the comps, you recognize interpretive, normative, and critical. I really started to incorporate it into everyday language for my students. And mind you, I teach Indigenous populations of Los Angeles. Academic English doesn't come easy to anyone, really, but it's an extra struggle when it's not like spoken in other domains, you know. So when I go on ahead and I have to teach these like critical analyses and like how to write an essay or how to include like deep analysis in the writing in the most effective manner possible, it becomes this like big Goliath. And Sarah and I have teamed up together to like fight that, and it's been extremely successful. So I'll just walk you through what I kind of do in the day-to-day with interpretive, normative, and critical. And we'll start talking about your design as a first-year teacher or as a 10th-year teacher, and then we'll go from there. So interpretive's really simple. Interpretive starts with how does the student or yourself interpret the information that they're seeing, whether that be a novel or a video you show in class, or some kind of speech they might have seen, or any kind of stimuli that you go on ahead and you offer, right? So you give them sentence starters, something like, I'm interpretive of X, Y, and Z, or the way that I'm interpreting this novel and relating it to my life includes X, Y, Z, right? Then you go into critical, which is that level 2 analysis, and Sarah will talk to you about those levels again. You go into normative. Normative would have you take that interpretation and then decide the way things should be. So I'm interpretive. My interpretive stance is that Title I schools and the Indigenous...
for Coates. Tell them about the book you're reading about Coates.
Okay, I'm reading a book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's Between the World and Me. And it's amazing because it goes into like really, really deep levels of understanding with like bodies of people of color or racialized people, and what that means in history. And so I look at it in that kind of lens, right? And obviously I'm inserting my politics a little bit here, but it's a really amazing book in that it's broken down how all these voices have been silenced in history. And this is where that marriage of like language, English and history come into play in our classrooms, right? So like when I talk about interpreting something, I always say, and you can present your bias in this way. This is important, especially for first-year teachers. Your whole job is political. And I mean political in the way that it's a negotiation of resources, right? That's my definition of politics. So if you're going into a classroom and thinking that you're not going to be political, it's a whole different reality once you're day to day and you're teaching the populations you're teaching, right? So for me, it's like I go on ahead and I'll present like, hey guys, hey all of my folks in here, the position I'm taking is an extremely political one, and you already know that I'm liberal, and I'm using my conceptual tools to interpret, to create a normative stance and then a critical stance of whatever it is we're reading. My students are always free to go on ahead and disagree with me and argue, but their arguments should be strong, and that's what we're building. Okay, so Sarah, do you want to add more to that? Because I think that's like super important.
Well, I think just to piggyback on that, I think the reason Erica and I got so into working together is that while she teaches this on the English side, I have to do this from the historical perspective. And one of the first things I noticed as a history teacher is that even the textbooks themselves present their own bias. And I couldn't have done this particular work without the kids being able to, one, relate history to themselves, two, identify what the normative interpretations, the different interpretations of history were, and then hence be critical of them. So this piggybacks very well between our subjects, but you can even do this in other subjects as well. Yeah, sorry, I hope that had like that's kind of where I went with this.
Oh, no, it's good. I think we should have that discussion, especially now. I get a lot of new teachers that go into like the profession, and they'll tell me, like in my master's program that I'm currently in, right? They'll tell me something like, aren't you supposed to be unbiased? Aren't you just supposed to present facts? And my whole thing is like, there are no such things as facts as you think about them, right? The truth is that we all carry our own like conceptual tools and perceptions. I think it's important though that you highlight that you tell your students, this has colored my perception. And this is where the interpretive, normative, and critical come into play, because once they understand where you're coming from and your arguments, then they can start to like critique and analyze themselves. And then they can create their own normative stances. And then they're taking the tools that you're giving them and they're applying them. And that's really where this gets at. That's really good pedagogy if you think about it that way, right?
Yeah, and you don't have to jump in. You don't have to jump in with your opinion at the beginning. More so as you need to show them that this exists in every single thing, including your teacher.
That's right.
You know, and even if you want to say, hey, well, I won't tell you what I think right now, but here's what you should know. I'm going to hold bias. Like I tell my students all the time, I'm a history teacher. I own my bias. Like it is what it is. Here are 3 different ways of understanding the Civil War. Which one do you agree with?
That's right. Yeah, you totally have to do that. And yeah, you don't have to come out with it outside, up front. I just like to be really upfront because, it's just, it just makes them feel really comfortable. But I mean, if you're not comfortable doing that out the gate, I understand. And I don't know the politics of your school or anything like that. We're really fortunate that way. But you want to feel out your administration too. And I think that's keep yourself safe and discuss politics and marry it to your content. Because if you do that, then of course you're fine. That's the goal. So again, with like the interpretive, normative, and critical, and we veered off a little bit, but so like I'll use Coates's book, right? I'm interpreting the world through Ta-Nehisi Coates's eyes, and saying that history in America is the destruction of bodies. Let's just go there, right? Let's go with a big theme. So my interpretive then informs my normative, where I would say, because history is a rendering or a retelling of the destruction of bodies, in particular Black bodies, the way Ta-Nehisi Coates describes, then I would say that my normative stance would be that revisionist history can help us understand history's visions as told by like predominant voices and powerful voices of the time, and how that needs to be rewritten, right? How history should be rewritten to include Black bodies or brown bodies or women or transgender folk bodies, right? So then after that normative comes in, then you introduce the critique, right? I'm also critical of maybe Ta-Nehisi Coates's views. I think maybe they're one-sided. So if you go through normative and critical and interpretive, then you're hitting all of those different levels of thought. It's like gold, right? Because your students will get to this point where they're using these frames in their everyday language, and their arguments are so much richer, and your curriculum begins to be something that you're super interested with, because it's like a lot of intellectual work. And as a teacher, like you want to make it to year 20 if that's what you so desire, and not be burned out and not think, God, I just hate covering this book again. You don't have to cover the book. You can go on ahead and grow with your curriculum and have these really great conversations in your class that you too learn from. And that's the goal.
Exactly.
Any other ideas?
I think if you were to watch our first webinar, it goes back to that levels of thinking. So
Right.
You're taking it from there to this, and you're applying it to a specific history or English or both or science, concept. Yeah, I think, I think that's base one. And a lot of people say, well, you have to form this worksheet to do this. And in reality, all you need is a piece of text that the kids are going to find interesting and relevant to whatever it is you're teaching.
That's right. And I will go on ahead and I will put that up now. I created a Google Doc with all of these sentence stems. What I do is I print them out like on cardstock, and I just put like a ring in them, and then I have different sets for each of my tables, and the kids just go off with those sentence stems, and I'll tell them like start with the sentence stems and then build.
So do you think we should head over to writing?
Yes, we should. So we use that pre-writing, right? The critical, normative, interpretive, just to get their ideas down and to be able to dialogue and converse. And they literally write 3 sentences for me, which is easy on your grading. It's easy on your eyes. You can check before the period's over. That could be your exit ticket. You can go a million ways with that, and it's really good for their pre-writing. But that pre-writing will lead to deeper analysis in their writing, right? So you want to incorporate that interpretive, normative, and critical in essays or in their poetry or in their narratives or expository writing or whatever, what have you. It just depends on what you need them to do, right? Or what they need to learn, even more so. So the way that I do that is with an influence chart, and I'll put that on Beg, Borrow, Speak as well. But basically, it's taking those 3 stances and then building a really strong thesis statement that then informs the rest of their essay or their project. So here, I think it's like a really good stopping point, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Sarah. In the credential program, and I noticed it's just like, it's kind of in every credential program that I've ever seen anyway. There's this idea of like backwards by design, right? Where you're like teaching 101, you're going on ahead and you're deciding on the project that you want to end up with, right? And then designing all of your lessons to support that project or that skill or that analysis. I think that it's a good way to start, but it really like neglects the process. It's not making the process as important as that like one outcome. And so I've never really ascribed to that notion.
So we're tiptoeing into something that might be controversial, but there's basically 2 ways of doing this. You plan ahead what you're going to do by having, say, you're going to have a quiz in chapter 3, and then you cover chapter 3, And when you're done covering chapter 3, you have your quiz. And you write the quiz before you have chapter 3, right? There's a couple of problems with this. One is allowing for students to kind of be able to steer where their education might go. So you know that, for example, you're going to cover the Civil War, right? And you know that you need to say test them on a specific skill. Like, can they analyze a primary source document from the Civil War? But if you only backwards plan, you don't always have the room to, and this takes, I think, some practice as a teacher to kind of allow for student input of what they're learning. And I think that's one of the things we keep playing around with, is how to give students the room they need to discover this information for themselves versus just memorizing what's in chapter 3.
Right. Or even just like if you're looking at the standards and thinking that they're limiting, they're not. They're totally interpretive. But you know, like the skills that they want them to learn are basic, and you should use them as a jumping off point, you know? Like, what can they really do with these skills in their real life? And I think once you start to answer that question, and once you start immersing yourself, you know, the students that you're teaching, or once you start to really realize what big challenges they're facing, then that'll start to inform your lesson planning. And you can really address what they need in their life. Okay. So do you have any other thoughts on writing, or do you want to move on, Sarah?
One is, I definitely think that we tend to assume that because, like, for example, Eric and I have a lot of people that are, say, writing at, like, I don't know, 4th to 7th grade level.
Yeah. And they're like in 11th grade, just so we get that picture.
Yeah, it's a real diverse set, like, level of writing, however we want to call that. And our tendency is to assume that because they're there doesn't mean they understand, you know, difficult material. That's not the case. It's more like, how can we bring the material to them to help them understand how to write it?
Right.
And then there's even, you know, and then there's even the, like, well, what are we doing with writing standards, and what, this is a rabbit hole I want to go down, but are we supposed to just be teaching standards, or are we supposed to, is language a movable thing? And is it more the idea and the concept and what they want to do with it that's more important than if they have a period in the right place?
Right. And I mean, you know, you'll decide that. I mean, I got into teaching English because language was power, or language is power. And it gives you the vehicle to express your ideas and to make things move and to mobilize, right? It was a total political act. And I know that, Sarah, you got into it because it was a total political act for you as well. You really need to think about, like, these tools, and they're basic, but you also need to think about, like, how political this is for your students, right? So if you're teaching in, like, a place where, like, we're teaching in urban, and I don't even know if urban's a good word for it, because whatever, that's another rabbit hole I won't jump down, but like, you're teaching in an urban Los Angeles school, right? Where the access to academic English is not, and again, in all of the domains that your students inhabit, right? Then you need to think about not only meeting your students where they're at, but what's the importance of them mastering these standards, right? And for me, it's highly important, but it's not as important as them thinking critically and coming up with those normative stances and coming up with things that can go on ahead and mobilize their ideas. So like where like an administrator might, like, ask of you, like, they need to learn, you know, they need to know about their grammatical errors, right? Or something like that. They're important, but they're not as important as they're thinking. And I mean, and you can feel free to disagree with me on that, but I mean, ultimately, I think Sarah knows that I'm an English teacher and I'm very much about mastering all those things because I know it's powerful to do so, but not at the expense of their social emotional like well-being. And that's what'll lead us into this next topic, which is huge. I'm sure Sarah has a lot to say there, but anyway, let's move forward. No. So we use these common reading and writing strategies to help you teach that whole person, to scaffold, and to create a community within our classroom. So I'm going to go into this intersectionality map that I created. And if you're not like, familiar with the term intersectionality, it's basically taking all the different parts of a person's identity in America or in any part of the world, and viewing how those different parts of their identity affects their day-to-day life and affects everything that they do, right? So let's take a look. Teaching the whole person. So if you want to just take a look at all those bubbles there, that's basically what makes up a student's identity or your identity, right? It makes up everybody's identity. And it's things or isms like culture, gender, government, business, peers, family, school, community, health, and privilege. This is very much what Sarah and I teach, because every single student needs to understand how those different parts of their identity has then molded and shaped their experience today, and then will inform their actions for their future. So do you want to say anything about this, Sarah, or should I begin to elaborate on each of those little sections?
And you know what? Go through the sections and then I'll jump in.
Okay. So, you know what? There's a lot of sections here, and I think I'm going to go on ahead and break them down even more so in different webinars, because it's just a whole load of content for each. But let's take a pressing one. Let's take one like gender, right? That's a big conversation that's happening now in America and in politics. But if you look at gender, then you start to think about how that shapes our perceptions in our writing and what we say and what we do. So at the beginning of the year, I have my students map out their intersectionality. What's their gender? What's their culture? What's their privilege, right? A lot of them don't know much about gender, right? They don't know that most of them are cisgender, or some of them might be questioning and they have no idea what to call themselves. There's 62 different genders now. I mean, and it's our job to go on ahead and affirm who they are in our classrooms if we want to get the level of thinking and comfortability that needs to go along with that. So if you think about gender, then you start to think about, or the student starts to think about, okay, who am I reading? What's their gender? What's their experience? And how is it formulating or coloring their perceptions, right? Do I necessarily agree? What's coloring my perceptions? All of a sudden, you start to think, each student starts to think about who everyone is, right? And starts to honor their experiences within the class. So if you're thinking about classroom management, this is a real organic and honest way to do it. You start to have those conversations. Some people on those maps at the beginning of the year leave them blank. Some people change them, we had one of our students who just, she identified as a woman at the beginning of the year. It's now the middle of the year, and Ollie refers to himself as a man. And he was able to affirm that identity because we had that discussion. So it's a lot of reality there, and it's a lot of interpretive stuff that happens on a personal level and on a real level. And that's where that social emotional support comes in. And no prouder moment for me.
I'm going to piggyback here and say that same student then came into my classroom and did an analysis of LGBTQ rights in modern America, like today in the Trump era, versus women who cross-dressed during the Civil War.
See, goodness, how else could you get that if you didn't have that discussion, But
right.
Go ahead.
you know, or the influence of like Latino women in like World War II and like movements that are here. So I think the thing is, because you start this off at the beginning of the year, is it allows me to like put like I give them 3 different history texts based on the same idea. Like, so they'll look at like Gordon Wood, who's a really conservative historian who looks at American history, looks at like the American Revolution, and I'll compare it to Howard Zinn, or we'll look at like Thomas Jefferson's primary sources, and they can see, okay, well, where is their perspective coming from? In fact, I had them do this with all of their textbooks, including the one they have in your class, and the only one that didn't have white men of a certain age was the one that you're teaching right now.
Yeah. And I mean, and shout out to that textbook that finally came out. It's My Perspectives. It's this like white book. And they finally came out with like a usable textbook. But here's the thing. Here's the very reality that you will face. You'll go in to your first year, and I want you to be safe, and I want you to be comfortable, and I want you to do what's practical. But you can start to marry whatever is in your text to other texts. Like there's no reason why you can't cover a standard using other or alternative texts or texts that support that textbook, or you know, and we'll even be radical and say that, you know, if a textbook is usable and they're out there, they're dated because of funding or whatever such nonsense, then you definitely need to look into alternative sources to go on ahead and support your students more. And there's nothing wrong with that. And you need to do what you need to do. And that I'll just say, you know. But on top of that, like do diversify your reading, because it matters. It matters in the sense that like the students feel like they're being told a narrative that's multifaceted and diverse, and it matches them.
Or go have them find text based on a common subject that they're interested in. Yeah. Okay, everybody, we're going to learn about the Roaring Twenties. Go find a piece of text. It doesn't have to be a book. From a source. I always go over like what's a good source, what's a bad source. And then you're going to present it, and that's part of the assignment is everyone reads like something they find interesting in each historical time period.
Right. No, that's excellent. And so in that way, like we do the cross-curricular thing, right? I focus on intersectionality. Sarah focuses in just as much. She focused on the historical perspective in her history class. It's U.S. history. And then I take it into American Lit, and I present like more recent occurrences, and I marry that to their text too. So it's a good vehicle to just support your students and their social emotional needs and their identities. And then we have these really honest conversations. And like, you know, here's the other thing. Sarah and I we work really well together, but we're completely different people, right? Where like we're both very emotional, but there are things that she's not necessarily comfortable with, and there are things that I'm not necessarily comfortable with. And here's the good thing is that we support each other enough to where I'm like, okay, I see this kid is having this issue, right? And I bring Sarah in the conversation, and she has more experience with it. So there goes that support, or vice versa, right? Or maybe they need some kind of personality skill set that you have versus like a teacher that you're working with. Feel free to go on ahead and ask for that support. You need the help, because people don't just get raised on their own. It doesn't happen that way, right? You had a whole community that fed you and clothed you and talked to you and taught you things. High school works the same way, except we have those unfortunate things we call walls, and these kids get into this idea that every classroom is like a separate world, but they're really not. They're things that support one another, and once you start to work with somebody else, it'll just open up that world to you and to those students.
I totally agree.
Yeah. All right, so let's move forward. Big topic. Scaffolding. Sarah, you want to take this one?
Okay, so I think one of the first things I ever saw that was really effective with scaffolding is what you want to do with scaffolding is you want to put on your board or on your lesson like 5 and lower, and the 5 being the hardest thing that you want them to do and the 1 being the easiest, so that they can work their way up the ladder of difficulty. And they know it's like right there to do that. And whether it's English language learners, or sometimes we have students that have dyslexia or there's specific things that are challenging to them, you kind of have a way of dealing with the kids who, let's say, are honor students and they get through things really quick, or dealing with the students that might take a little bit longer. So that's number 1 when it came to scaffolding that I always like to think about. And the other thing is too, they're mainstreaming special day students, which is good. The segregation is not necessarily great, being a special day class your whole educational career is not necessarily a healthy thing, but you're going to have to deal with some of the special things that are like some of the issues that come into from their lives. And so, you'll have maybe one person in there, but I think if you make things really clear and they're put from easiest to most difficult, it gives everybody room. And if you combine that with a safe space to make mistakes and there are clear norms that tell you that, then it's even better.
Totally. And I mean, here's where it gets really tricky, because like I remember entering the workplace, and this was the most daunting part for me, was to scaffold for all the different kind of learners that that were going to enter my door, right? That special needs, or children that we call English language learners, which I don't necessarily believe in, but they're there, and students that are like not classified, right? That like that just are having special like challenges in their life, right? Like they don't know where they're going to get their next meal from, or maybe their parents lost their jobs and they're moving and they don't know what that's going to look like, right? So when you're scaffolding, I would say take it little by little and scaffold with another teacher. Talk to that other teacher, because they probably have information that you don't necessarily have, and then it'll all start to make sense in your class, right? Maybe the student learns best when she's leading the conversation. Maybe the student, like has these certain like religious beliefs that are like not necessarily aligned with yours, and you need to design some kind of other like project or something so that they can go on ahead and like build on the skill that you want them to learn. So it's very much like a community effort, and I don't want you to ever feel like as a new teacher you have to do 1,000,001 things by yourself, because you don't. You shouldn't.
Well, and the other thing to think is you're not always going to get told what students like. I don't think I've ever really been told the particular challenge a student is having.
That's right.
You kind of figure it out as you go along, and that's why the like 1 through 5 thing helps. And also just paying attention. You got to know your students. Like if somebody's not willing to know their students, there probably shouldn't be in the teaching profession.
You shouldn't. And like and really like you should be getting to know their names relatively quickly. I know it's a lot of work for me. It doesn't come easy to me, but I have my little things, and like however you want to do that is fine. I mean, a seating chart works for that really well. But that's important. Like you should know their name. You should know something a little bit special about them. What I did also, and that was really useful at the beginning of the year, is I had them answer this prompt just to get a feel for their writing and where they were at. But it was, I wish my teacher knew ... right? So I got this like litany of different things, but be careful as well, because, and you could even tell your students this, like, anything you share with me, it's confidential, but also understand that if your life is in danger, then I need to report that. And it's pretty understood, you know what I mean? But you get these different things, like I had one of our students, he was like, oh, I don't understand like written work if it's not being read to me. Like I need somebody to read it to me. And all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I can accommodate that, right? I can get like her access to Audible, or I can get a student to read it to her in small groups. You know, I can sit her next to one of her really good friends and she won't feel any kind of way about it, right? So I mean, there's different ways you can go about that. That's a real quick and easy way. The other thing is like bother to have those conversations in the hall. You know, I don't walk down the hall in like 2 minutes ever, because some student will stop me and they'll want to talk to me, or they'll want to share something with me, or they crack a joke or whatever. That's a part of your job too, you know? Like, it's a very human job. It's a very it's a service job. And so I think Sarah's right. It's not for someone who wants to like sit in your office and grade all day and not have any interaction with the students that you're affecting, for sure.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is make friends with one of the special education teachers.
Yes.
If you can, see if you can use like digital, i.e. like Google Docs or something. You can shoot them your lesson plan and they can help you maybe scaffold some of it till you get used to it.
Yeah.
If that's not available, then it's not available. But, you know, I think that's one of the parts that you could probably consider as well.
Yeah. And then work with your English language development specialists too. I mean, that's what they're there for. They're there to provide that support that you need. I mean, you know, you have like, you learn your SEDAI strategies in program, but that'll only take you so far. You really do need other hands there. It's a lot of work for sure, but you'll get there.
So,
okay.
Go ahead.
You want to move on?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, creating community. So this harkens back to some of the stuff that you were mentioning, Sarah. I'm just building on it. Building that consistency, the clarity, practical expectations in your class and in your lesson planning. Consistency is key, especially with their age level. Like, we're in high school. I mean, it'll happen in junior high. It'll happen as your students start to become more aware of it. I mean, I have a 3-year-old at home, and if I'm not consistent with her, it kind of dampens her mood. It kind of kills her a little bit, you know? So being consistent is key, because it gives everybody that like even keel. It's equality in action, right? So when you're consistent, that means that when you say that, for instance, you know, nobody's going to use degrading language in my classroom, or disrespect anyone while we're having Socratic seminars. And if they do, these are the consequences. And that means that I'm going to deliver on those consequences. And it's going to be consistent, and it's going to be fair, and it's going to match the offense. It's going to make that offense right again. So I'm really clear about those expectations. I set them at the beginning of classes. We have like these table discussions, and Sarah had created these like community standards that we always kind of refer to. As long as you have that in place, they're usually pretty respectful. And if a student's having a really hard time that day, and who knows why, right? They can be angry for any number of reasons. Maybe their parents are not there anymore. Maybe a brother died. It happened twice last year for me. You need to be able to go on ahead and have that conversation. Also, the other thing that I put into my room, and that Sarah's implemented as well, is that timeout center. Like that, it's, what do we call it? The peace corner, right? The peace corner is amazing. And it's really simple. If a student is acting out, I literally will tell them, hey, go sit on that purple chair over there and just fill this out, right? And it's this file that I created on my online platform for my class. It's for us, it's on Schoology for LAUSD. It could be on PowerSchool for you, or some other such platform, right? And so they go and they sit there and they start to fill it out. Now that can feel like kind of time out-ish, but it becomes so much more than that, because I've had a student, like several students, go to that corner because they need 5 minutes just to kind of like collect themselves. And they're allowed to do so in my class, so long as they're not disruptive and it's only 5 minutes. And they'll time themselves. I have a timer there too if they want to, but they'll time themselves. and I'll just like look at them and I'll nod and I'll hold up the number, like 5 fingers on my hand, and they like nod back, and that's it. Doesn't disturb my class, allows them the time to like kind of calm down. And then I can go on ahead and go back there when I have a spare minute, and I'll be like, are you okay? Do you need something? And like usually it's like, yeah, I need to go to the restroom, or I need a tissue, or I'm just having a really tough day today. Like I don't want to talk to anybody. And they do it. And it's like totally amazing. And it's helped their well-being so much. So like it's just crazy.
I think there's a couple of things. I think the biggest disasters I've seen are teachers that are authoritarian and inconsistent. So like they don't practice what they preach. And then the teachers who are, it's kind of like being a parent that wants to be a friend instead of there being their teacher that wants to be a friend, and they're not consistent with what they need. So then, yeah, and so there's a level between that. And everyone has a different thumbprint. You're going to have the reason we're talking about this stuff now is if you're working at, say, a Title I school, or a school that has English language learners in a high level, or ones that have, it doesn't really matter because you can find them in any school. But bottom line is, when you start doing reading and writing or taking academic risk in any form or fashion, you might have behavior problems because they're also teenagers going through life. So not only are you asking them to take academic risk, but this also goes back to their intersectionality chart. Like they're going to have stuff that they're going through, and so you need to have a space where people can feel safe, even if mistakes happen, even if you as a teacher make a mistake or some other student does. Just being able to have hard conversations is important, and then also set boundaries for yourself and everybody else. And that also extends to like lesson planning. I know for me, it took me 5 years to figure out like an okay level of pacing, so that the kids were really understanding it, but I wasn't going too slow. And then, the other thing is like, I would give them like really hard levels of text, but I also had to put in things that made it easier for them to understand it. So for example, I had them read two different arguments on the Federalist Papers. Well, this writing was like straight out of a UCLA, history class. So it was like 6 pages of high-level academic writing. So I made it kind of like a game where they had to find true or false based on the reading. Is this statement true based on what you read in this article? And then they have to provide proof of it. So you're allowing for them, you're scaffolding in a sense of you're kind of giving them possible hints and answers, but at the same time, they're still expected to read a high level of text. And you can look at that by having them use thesauruses instead of dictionaries. You can have them do say mean matter, or say bias mean matters. You can, have them do annotations in whichever fashion you think is acceptable for your classroom. And those are just kind of certain ways to do it. But before they're going to do it, you're going to have at least a connection in place so that they're willing to go down that road of taking on this really difficult stuff.
Totally.
And better for them to try it with you in high school than to get to college and drop out because they can't handle it.
Right. And like better for them to like, we've had students that are like cry their way through a project that they find really hard. But the important part is they're trying and they're doing it, and they're willing to take the critique and build. And that's also a big question in like the way that you grade and the way that you assign value to things. The process is so much more important than the actual outcome at that point. Okay, so let's move on. I think and the questions, comments, or worries section. You can click on this and you can leave that comment or that question, or if you want us to build on something, or even if you have like any suggestions for our next webinar, this is a great place to put that. Or you can email us directly, and we're definitely open to a lot of different things. Sarah, did you want to add any last thoughts or
No, thanks for being an amazing teacher, Erica.
Oh, you know what, Sarah, you're amazing. Truly, like I couldn't do half of the things I do because I
Oh,
mean, like,
stop
you're
it. They're going to start throwing up.
seriously no, like I couldn't do any of the things that I dream of doing without the support, and Sarah really does support. So again, like, find somebody that you jive with. They don't have to be in the same content area. They don't have to be in the same grade. It's just a teacher friend that you know that you can get support from.
Awesome. You guys, thanks for joining us on webinar number 2 of Beg, Borrow, Speak. Have a glorious evening / holiday / afternoon / morning, depending on when you're actually reading this. Or sorry, watching it.
All right. See ya.
Bye.